morning, everyone. Thank you, Dylan, for that excellent introduction. And I don't need to repeat it, but I think the key issue is where 70% of men in a recent survey of white men felt disenfranchised by the interventions of DEI. I look forward to a lively discussion. I'd like to introduce my partners and colleagues on the team, and I'll start with Jeremy, who is right next door to me. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning.
Jeremy is head of markets in Rabobank and part-time food council member in City Harvest, redistributing food waste to those who need it most. Jeremy leads Rabobank's trading, sales, and capital markets activities in London, oversees financial markets research. He supports his clients, raising funding to support M&A and refinancing in the bank and capital markets, hedging interest rates, foreign exchange, and commodity risk. Alongside this role, and relevant to today, he is also responsible for driving inclusion globally within the markets division of Rabobank. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And moving on to Ian Workman beside him. Ian is Chief Customer Officers in Homes England. He is an experienced managing director with scale leadership skills in business, corporate, and commercial banking. He has a track record of achieving financial results and improving client engagement, experienced in credit risk management, regulatory remediation, and project management. He is recognized as an industry leader and expert in the SME sector, having worked with thousands of businesses across the UK in all sectors. He is a passionate advocate of social business, social impact, equality, and societal diversity. And over the last 12 months, Ian has taken his experience into the public sector working for Homes England. Welcome, Ian. And moving on to Graham Fox. Graham is a chartered engineer. He's president of the Institute of Refrigeration and director of the Building Engineering Services Group. His specialities are heat pumps, heat recovery, renewables, and debunking legislation, which is very welcome. He has extensive experience at managerial and director levels as a contractor and within trade associations, driving the legislative agenda and guiding stakeholders through regulatory changes. He's an experienced public speaker, delivering technical or educational seminars and hosting technical webinars. Welcome, Graham. And last, but by no means least, Katerina Poloneska. She is a high-performance relationship coach, consultant, and gender dynamic social scientist. Katerina helps hardworking high achievers be as successful in their relationships as they are in their careers. She solves the classic work-life dilemma resulting in depression and loneliness. Welcome, everyone. And I think we'll start today, and Dylan introduced this issue of how do we counter the feeling that white men feel excluded from the diversity, equity, and inclusion interventions being carried out by their companies. I would like to start with asking Jeremy a question, that as a white man engaging in DEI at your organization, would you say you feel excluded? And how is your experience consistent with other white men in your organization?
No, many thanks. I mean, for me personally, I don't feel excluded, and I have the privilege and the opportunity to really focus on inclusion-related initiatives as part of my role. But I do recognise that experience or that viewpoint is not necessarily shared by all of my male colleagues. And I think it is important to recognise that many see diversity, equity, and inclusion in some ways as a threat because something's being taken away from them, from their perspective. So, for example, you have a promotion opportunity or a new role that comes up. In a sense, you're now facing more competition. And so in that sense, diversity, equity, and inclusion can be perceived as something of a threat. And like many organizations, Rabobank has imposed some targets focusing on trying to improve, for example, gender diversity. So that, in essence, if you impose that type of target, you can make certain colleagues feel they're being sidelined, and that sort of sense of resentment, either consciously or unconsciously, can start to emerge, and you can sort of feel almost as if certain roles are being filled with a diversity hire, and you can hear people utter very unhelpful comments like, she's only got the role because she's a woman, type of remark, for example. And I think also it's fair to say that some men feel that diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't really about them. So there's a lot of discussion, almost as if they are the problem, those that have caused the issue in the first place. And certainly a few years ago in the banking industry, a lot of the diversity initiatives were linked to women in banking, and actually all the language around it really, I think, didn't help men feel included as part of that conversation. And of course, it's incredibly important that we do engage men in this conversation, because if we don't, often they are in that position of power when they can make a difference. So I think another important point to make is that not every male individual that I work with necessarily recognizes that they're also benefiting from DEI. So, shared parental leave, flexible working arrangements, etc. And also some of the language which is used around diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't always feel comfortable for people. So if we're talking about feelings, inclusion, or concepts like psychological safety, not everybody feels comfortable because they're nervous about saying or doing the wrong thing. So yeah, those are some of my comments really about why perhaps not everybody feels included.
Thank you, Jeremy. And same question to Graham.
Morning. So, Building Engineering Services Association, we're a trade body that represents contractors. So, traditionally predominantly male sector, and our members are the contracting businesses. So they very much stereotypically, I should say, reflect that. So I think it's quite difficult for men to speak up or to speak out and call out things that have been done badly when you work in a company or an industry like that. But for myself, the BESA isn't actually representative of the sector at all. Our managers group representing the various heads of department has 13 women and 11 men. So it's actually pretty representative of the population. And in our member services team, which represents my department, technical, alongside legal, employment affairs, health and safety specialist groups, we have 6 heads of department, 3 women, 3 men. We also have 2 from ethnically diverse backgrounds as well. So it's actually really a really good balance, I guess, a reflection of society, that management structure that we have within BESA, but it's sadly not typical of my sector. So I don't think I feel particularly excluded on this subject. I have experienced some pushback from colleagues, usually in the way little comments that are made. If I've been doing a bit of advocacy work and pushing this agenda, there's some of the little comments that I think with hindsight may indicate some jealousies or resentment simmering away. But I do have to say that they are very much in the minority from my experience, and also tend to come from women, not men. I know Jeremy's talking about that kind of pushback and resentment from men in the organisation, but actually it tends to be more from women in my experience, my organisation, which just adds another dynamic to it.
Very interesting. Let's say, Ian, the same question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and good morning, everyone. Good to be here. So I think it's really interesting. Similar to Jeremy, and I don't feel excluded, and I feel part of the conversation. But to the stats you mentioned, Ian, 70% white men do, and in my conversations, it's a lot around education, and that forms into 2 parts. I think the first part, and alluding to what Graham talked about, is that increasingly white, probably middle-aged men, are scared to ask a question, because they're scared to ask a question about something they don't understand and to be ridiculed for it, or to be criticized for asking that question. Why don't you know that answer, etc. And so men being introverts in some respects when it comes to mental health. That's how they will react. They'll say, well, rather than be in that position, I won't ask the question, but then that leads to disengagement. The second thing is around education. And for me, when I also talk about this, is around equity, not equality. And, I remember when I was in banking, I used to be asked quite a lot, why is there a women's network? Why is there an LGBT network? Why is there not a men's network? Well, actually, part of that was around equity. And if you looked at it, men were doing pretty well in the career working place, particularly in banking. But there was a void of anything else, and that diversity of thought. And so these organizations were there to provide assistance, to provide equity, so everybody got the same opportunity. But sometimes there was a lack of education about why we have these things, and people get focused on actually what's happening out there. So I think more that we can have events like this, where we get to talk about the importance of that equity. We can ask those questions in a safe environment. That's actually how we'll get more men engaged in thinking around, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for equality? What does this mean for my wife, my partner, my daughter, my niece, whatever it is, going forward? And actually, how does that impact our children, our sons as well? And how to ensure they're educated so the next generation don't feel they're in this position as well.
Interesting. I like the equity versus equality difference. Katrina, last but by no means least, from your perspective, what have been your observations in dealing with white men engaging in DEI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my specialization, interestingly enough, is disenfranchised white men, typically blue collar. And in my time in DE&I, what I've seen, and I'm a white female, is there's a natural reservation and suspicion to DE&I, which has been alluded to in this dialogue, and is very understandable, and rightly so in many ways, because what I found is that the way that DE&I has been handled across many organizations, when we think about organizational development, hasn't in fact been in a very diverse and inclusive way. So if we think about that self-reflexivity, it hasn't been actually practicing what it preaches. And again, I can understand that. I have a degree in essentially feminism, that I chose to study masculinity precisely because I recognized if we continue having a dialogue, a discussion without including men, then we're losing the battle. It's inclusion for everyone, diversity for everyone. And so there's a very natural reservation, suspicion, a fear, an eagerness to get it right, but a fear of getting it wrong. And I understand DE&I has started out in more of the academic spaces, being critical, angry, full of what a theorist called Dolly Shark talks about, heat. It's kind of very emotive, visceral language, confronting the issue straight on. And then it shifted to being more tokenistic. Suddenly we had unconscious bias training everywhere, and suddenly became this kind of mandatory thing that everyone has to do on their lunch break. No one really understood why. And it became, a thing in the background. Then it went back to being at the forefront. And so D&I has been handled in this very confusing way. And so naturally, again, when we think about engaging, quote unquote, kind of the white male populace, there's a reservation around it. Is it just another fad? I hear that all the time. Is it a fad? Which is mind-blowingly ridiculous to me that it's a fad. It's like, are human rights a fad? But there's this idea that, is it a fad? Or is it something to be afraid of? And so I get it. What I am really passionate about is, and again, I go back to Dolly Shark, who's an incredible theorist on this. When we think about D&I, there needs to be a hybrid approach. So the heat approach, this kind of more angry, challenging the norms, creating discomfort, is brilliant in academia. It's necessary to fuel that fire, but it also risks creating backlash and rejection. And that's what I think we've been seeing with a lot of the white male populations. Then there's the light approach, which is being more factual, descriptive, talking about humanity, meeting people where they're at. And that's also very helpful, but that risks moral licensing and complacency. So actually we need a bit of a hybrid approach. And my own personal way and experience of kind of handling this really nuanced topic, is recognizing kind of what Jeremy alluded to, which is, not white men aren't necessarily happy. So this idea of being privileged and, you're white and you're male and so everything's working out is a myth, because we've used the term disenfranchised. Beneath it, there are two really core fundamental areas of disenfranchisement. One is unfortunately economic. I mean, everyone's arguably suffering economically at this point in time, but there's also this disconnect between the narrative of, well, as a white male, everything's figured out for you. You're going to roll out of university, get the job, get the house, get the wife, and everything's great. That's really not happening these days for many people. Most people are struggling financially, and that's an invisible struggle that isn't talked about because it's an invisible force. So that's one form of disenfranchisement. And then the second is the actual limitations of the gender construct. So why is it that suicide is the number one killer of men? Why is depression so high? Why is addiction so high? The gender construct is inherently limited. And so there's a more broad disenfranchisement that's happening. So DE&I really is for everyone, because it's about including everyone in the discussion and recognizing that disenfranchisement isn't just about race, isn't just about gender, and even gender for white men is a form of disenfranchisement. So again, this resistance, this reservation, this fear of getting it wrong, I totally get it. And my whole approach is bring empathy, bring compassion, bring inclusion, bring diversity to the dialogue, bring that heat and light approach. And that's, to be honest, the only way I think that we can actually have that dialogue in a constructive way. Otherwise, there's going to be more and more backlash.
That's an intriguing observation, Katrina. Yes, I would fully agree with you. And to a certain point, I know it's an appropriate comment, but the issue is that DEI is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And all too often, you refer to tokenism and other issues, that in DEI training as imposed in organizations, I think tends to isolate people. And it is a little bit like my experience in, let's say, the quality models of Six Sigma, TQM, BPR. It's another TLA. It is not actually seeking results. But let's look at the question of the 70%, which you mentioned at the beginning, the isolated majority. What happens if we don't do something about it? What next? What's the consequences of the overall organization if we leave the isolation? Let's talk with Ian on this, or anybody is free to comment.
I think, Katrina, you've got a view on this. Do you want to come in first, and I'll follow you?
On the quotas question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so not sure if my opinion is quite the right one, but from my experience, things like, so when we think about driving change, there's different layers of change, right? Like we need the structural change, we need legal change, then we need behavioral change. So it's not simply about, well, we're going to raise the salaries or introduce quotas or create a new law. We can do that all we want. But if people don't understand why it's being introduced, what's the motivation behind it, how's it going to benefit them, then there's going to be pushback and resistance. So it's a multifaceted approach. We need to have some structural changes. Of course we do. You can't just, if we didn't have any structural structures for people to operate within, then it would be chaos. Structure is healthy. So having quotas, it can be healthy, but it really depends on, is that all that's being done? Or is there more layers to that change? Is there a communications plan to explain, here is why it's important, here's how it fits with the company mission, the values, where we're going, here's how it's going to benefit you, and here's how we can ensure that you feel safe, and we hear your resistance and bring that empathy and that inclusion into the conversation. That's a very different approach to just rolling out quotas and creating tokenism, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think that tokenism is the point that where men potentially start becoming disenfranchised and feeling left behind because they feel like the opportunities are being restricted to them. And that actually is being driven by a quota. It's really interesting because in financial services, the FCA set a target about 5 years ago for regulated companies in terms of gender diversity at board level. And that's interesting because you think, why do you just relate it to gender diversity? Because if you want diversity across a board, then shouldn't it be diversity in its broadest sense of thinking? And you've linked it to gender. And I've done some studies, so I'm studying a master's degree in equality and diversity, and I looked at this. And actually, when you compare financial services companies that have got this regulation to adhere to companies outside the FCA, so all other industries, there's not a huge amount of difference in terms of the amount of diversity on the board. And so therefore the argument is, do you need quotas? Do you need regulation to enforce diversity? Or actually, is it about education? And bearing in mind, the people that are making these decisions generally today are men. It's not right that it is, but a lot of these CEOs and senior executives are men, and they are making the decisions voluntarily in a lot of cases to improve diversity. So they're not being left behind. They are engaged in the conversation. But then it does come back to the point that Ian referenced at the start, around the 70% of men that do feel disenfranchised, and there is a danger they get left behind. And again, there's some useful statistics around this, because if you look at white working class boys in school, that is the sector that is being left behind in education now. Because there's been initiatives being put in place over the last 20, 30 years to make sure that girls have the right education, they weren't being left behind, and a lot of focus. And it's almost like the pendulum swung the other way. So actually, it's about how to make sure that everybody gets the equal opportunity and nobody's left behind. That for me, Ian, is how actually we bring everybody with us, so everybody feels like it's a fair place to be.
Also, maybe just to build on that as well, from a privacy perspective, many organizations, I think, struggle to capture data on different characteristics of diversity, so race, gender, etc. But all of those dimensions. I mean, you already mentioned that, you can be alienating by only focusing on one of those. I think that's also a real issue, because you put in place a quota, but unless you think about every dimension of diversity and a bit like what Katerina was saying, the communication of why you're doing that, I think it can be quite divisive. I think it's a good thing. Everybody wants to measure progress, and you want to measure success, and you want to make a difference. But actually, it's quite hard to measure. I don't think you can measure it statistically by the number of people of different characteristics that you have within your population or your team. I think it's a more relevant measure is probably how included do you feel, so you can survey people. But again, it's all of these things are flawed. So I think we have to be careful about how we measure it, and the initiatives that are put in place, and how we measure success.
I think for me, it's not so much about measuring it and data driven. It's actually about visibility. It's about creating those safe spaces and a safe environment for people or for men to kind of speak up. I'm a big believer in role models and kind of being what you see. And I think the more visibility we have, events like this one today, where we have kind of open dialogue and discussion about this kind of subject, it helps. I think that other men see men speaking out on this without getting criticised or picked on, or on social media being absolutely trashed for speaking out. But in an environment like this, it's a safe kind of place. That's why it's so important. But I think it's about that visibility and encouraging others to step up and speak out, really, for me.
Yep, that's very interesting. I think very much I hear permission to be part of the DEI activities. And it again leads us to what's the impact. In many cases, I've seen a situation where after you focus on a result, because I've worked for 20 companies in 26 countries, and probably measurably saved a couple of $100 million for the company. And what happens when you are dealing with resistance, which is often from, let's call them the dinosaurs of the business, and they're often, unfortunately, white males, that you can use the benefits of DEI as a weapon. And I think results focus is far better than tokenism. And this produces progress for everyone equally. Looking at your organization, and how do they ensure that all groups, in this case, are um, equally engaged in the DEI process. Do you have any process for the inclusion of the excluded majority or minority that we're talking about?
We do. I mean, I can talk forever, Venk, if you wish. I mean, for
Yes.
us, we work very hard to try and engage senior leaders to be sort of visible on diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. So that means turning up at events. That also means including the topic within communications, and visibly encouraging everybody to play their part. And you know, we've talked already about the importance of including male colleagues within that conversation. So within my own department, we've set up an inclusion group which includes male colleagues, because it's important that their voices are heard. You give them a platform so that they can also give their perspectives, and they can also help shape our own diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. So I think that helps a bit. And also, yeah, we've rolled out things like psychological safety training. So I suppose what we're trying to do there, we initially did that just for line managers. We then decided to roll it out to all staff because we wanted everybody to step up. So if for example, you're in a meeting and somebody's being talked over, irrespective of your position, you have an obligation to make sure that people are included in that conversation. Or if you see something happening in the office, which isn't appropriate, etc., we want everybody to be taking action. So by rolling out that type of training over time, I think that sort of chips away and improves the culture, so that everybody feels braver about stepping up and making a difference. We already talked a bit about representation. I think we've made a lot of efforts to try and include different categories of diversity within leadership teams. We've got a long way to go still, but I think that helps, and it helps sort of drive less of a disconnect between different groups. And simple things like mentor programs where you mix senior leadership with junior leadership, etc. I think that can also make a difference. And events like this, educational events, and putting those on and encouraging people to attend, those are all some of the things which I think can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. I think from my perspective, my organisation, it's a culture change thing that's desperately needed, and we have actually just recently started on that journey to try and look at that culture change within the organisation from the top down. You know, as I said, we actually have quite a good mix in the management within the organisation, but none of that has actually come about. We've talked about quotas and that kind of stuff. None of it has been because of quotas. It's just been a natural progression that people have been promoted within their departments. So it's been the best person for the job, regardless of you know exactly what equity should be about, right? It's about actually the best person for the job, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, sexuality, whatever. Which has been quite nice, and it was mind blowing. I think for me, that penny dropping moment when I was on one of the Teams calls, the management Teams calls, and looking around the face on the screen, and you realise you actually have that very good mix. So we've already got that without having to try and push that agenda, which has been a nice kind of organic growth. But you know, I think it was said earlier, DE&I is not it's not just for the minority or underrepresented groups to be speaking out. It takes everyone in society to be speaking up and making these necessary breakthroughs. You know, like it or not, the majority of senior roles, CEO roles, or you know, C-level, C-suite roles are still straight white men, and we're not going to see the culture change through society and through the various different business sectors without getting the buy-in of, you know, from the top down, not just from the few who get it. And I think for me that's really important. I mean, the big change in my life was when I became a father to two daughters, and I think I didn't want to watch them growing up and suffering, having to overcome the hurdles that my wife had to overcome. And I think when, you know, my wife talked to me when we were much younger than we are now, about some of the struggle, because she worked in a predominantly male industry as well, and I probably didn't get it or listen enough to her a long time ago. And it was actually when we had our own daughters that I started to think a bit more about that. There's a lot of work to be done The other thing I think Jeremy just mentioned about junior leadership, one of the things I've created a few months ago within the BESA is a Future Leaders Network, because I wanted to help people to network and make those business connections. So, and within that group, within 5 months, we've got about 15, I think it is, young people who have been identified by their employers as being future leaders of industry. We've got 40% female, 25% from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So again, we've got quite a healthy mix. And I think why that's important is because we're helping these people to network and build these business relationships now, that in 15, 20 years time, when they're running businesses and running the industry, they will already have these friendships and relationships, and it's already a nice diverse mixture within them. So that's going to be healthy for my industry going forward, I would imagine. And again, what I like about it, it's not been driven by quota, it's been organically driven.
Katrina, would you have a comment on what you mentioned? Tokenism and quotas is a perfect example of tokenism that forces it. But let's look at resistance. Like often the white male majority, who are identified as the 70%, use bullying and abuse and various other excuses to avoid accountability through busyness or other activities. What do you see as being the most effective way of changing behaviors on these, let's say, legacy managers?
The $1 million question. Where to start? Well, starting point might be, it has to come from the top down. It really has to come from the top down. And I think we often underestimate the importance of that. So many times I see DE&I initiatives, any kind of positive initiative, well-being initiatives, be put upon the shoulders of the folks on the ground, which is frankly unfair and unreasonable, or it's put on the shoulders of some poor minority member who's doing it pro bono for free, and they're pulling along the entire campaign. And that's just ridiculous to me. Like, how can anyone do that? It's just unfair. So we need allies, and those allies have to be the white men at the top. And how do we convince them that this is really important work? This is where I believe some heat is important, because not only the people who, I mean, you call them dinosaurs earlier, the people who are not pro integrating a culture of D&I into the very fabric of the business that they run, they are going to be left behind. And I think it needs to be made worse than that, frankly, because there's a fear of losing power. There's a fear of losing, I don't even know, status, whatever it might be. But that's incorrect. If we look at the data, every single millennial who's going to be in a leadership position expects D&I to be in the culture. All of the younger generations expect D&I to be in the culture. People are literally shifting away from companies that don't have diverse and sustainable business identities to ones that do. So there's a very real economic impact on being late to the party. And so it has to start from the top. It has to have allyship at the top, and it has to come from the white males. It cannot be on the poor female from a minority group who's been hired to be the VP of D&I. It's ridiculous. The amount of VPs of D&I that I know who are burnt out and who have just turned their back, myself included. There's a reason I don't work in D&I full time. And again, I'm a white female, so I cannot imagine the emotional labor that it takes to drive that behavioral change. It has to come from the top. And then after that, there has to be an emphasis on how D&I is relevant for everyone. And we have to move away from this very simplistic, two-dimensional kind of pop culture media narrative that D&I is just about race and gender, because it's not. It's about so much more than that. And we haven't even begun to unpick all the different layers of difference that make up our identities that can drive a sense of exclusion and a lack of psychological safety. Things like going for drinks after work. What if you don't drink? Things like working in a hybrid environment. What if you can't come to the office because you're disabled, because you're looking after your sick parents, because you're a single parent? All of these things lead to exclusion. Exclusion happens every single day in all the micro moments. The D&I really is for every single person, and there needs to be a re-education around how D&I can benefit every single person. And that has to come from the top, and it has to come from an ally, and it has to come from a white male. And there has to be a motivation, a driver of why is this so critically important, besides being a better husband, a better father. I get that a lot of men come to this realization when they have daughters. That's too late. That is too late. And plenty of people aren't having kids. And what if you don't have daughters? It is too late. The conversation has to start earlier. So, yeah.
What do you think, Ian?
Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree. And I think that's how you manifest change. I think also bringing the benefits more into the conversation. I think, when I talked about education earlier on, it's about actually there is a benefit to this. It's not just about equality and the benefits of equality. It's about actually the richness of conversation, the diversity of thought, the better business decisions that are made that lead to improved profits. McKinsey have done various different research on this topic, and it's there to see that actually where you have this breadth of diversity, then I think there are business results. But there was an interesting question from some people watching, one from Jackie Barrett, that talks about the diversity, which was interesting to me as well, which is I used to have this when I was in banking, was you'd have your women's network, you'd have your LGBT network, you might have your disability network. And I used to say, yeah, but what happens if, for example, you're a black female with a disability? Does that mean you've got to go to 3 different networks? And I think increasing, and I've forgotten her name now, there's a speaker from the US that coined this phrase around intersectionality. And I think this is the next debate that needs to be had, in that we can't just bucket diversity, because we've all got different characteristics. We've all got different things in our DNA, in our upbringing. So actually, how do you bring all that together and stop using labels as part of a D&I strategy? And actually, I think if we get to that stage, more men will understand it, because they too have different backgrounds and different things that affect them in different ways. And so I think an extension of that conversation, and I might be wrong, but I think Jackie's hit a good point there. I think this is where the conversation will progress, particularly that millennial generation that Katrina was talking about.
I agree fully in this area, because working with global companies and global resources, I've had people, in fact, white male dinosaurs and groups of, when I'm trying to hire someone, say, you can't hire him, he's gay. And I said, I wasn't trying to hire someone who's gay. I was trying to hire somebody to produce this output. And the same applies to, let's say, complexity and difficulty. People use DEI as an excuse. It's very difficult, same as transformation. I actually start with, it's extremely simple. If you want to achieve this and more of this, do this. Don't start with the trying to please everybody, which will please nobody, but you select the best person for the job and help them achieve it, particularly if they are from a minority diverse group. And it doesn't matter, your perfect example of the ultimate diversity mix is irrelevant in that case. It's the best person for the job, makes things work, and produces bottom line benefits.
And I agree with what you've just said there, but I also think that sometimes people get drawn into a view that in order to get the best person for the job, they have to be a looky-likey person, and perhaps their perception of the skill set that you need to fulfill a particular role sometimes needs challenging too. Because I've had people say to me, for example, a hiring manager, if I hire that person, we will not make as much money as quickly. But actually, that person with 6 months of training will, I think, add a lot of dimensions to the team, and would ultimately lead to a more productive team if you have a slightly longer term view. So I think sometimes it's also about challenging the perceptions of what skills you need to fulfill a particular role, and broadening your mind as to what sort of constitutes an effective team. I mean, we've already discussed, the more innovation and the obvious business benefits that diversity brings. Sometimes that's lost on people who are focused on very near-term profit. And also, I think there's almost a copycat hiring. It's easier to manage somebody. Will they fit in as another common phrase that I hear. Would so and so fit in with the team? What does that mean? I
Mm.
mean, are they the same as you? Are they, or are you actually welcoming somebody with a different opinion? Yeah, there's a lot in that.
Yeah, hire for attitude, develop the skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what Graham said. The best person for the job. I was asked to integrate 7 functions some time ago in HR. One of them was localization, who are mostly female group, and the female HR specialist said, "You're going to be very angry. 4 of them are pregnant." And I said, "What's that got to do with it? That's a normal part of what we have to do." It's the perception often in HR, which is isolating the DEI responsibility, that they are pandering to the established prejudices within the company. And I think if sticking DEI directly into the verticals and holding managers accountable is the only way to do it. Any comments?
I completely agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I will say there's something around having to de-bias the whole process, right? Promotional, how do you promote people? How do you hire? De-biasing that, which is tricky because, again, we don't know what we don't know. We all have our own blind spots. Similarity attraction bias, which is, I think, what you were referring to, Jeremy, is incredibly hard to spot. I remember I was once getting interviewed for a role, and the guy interviewing me, he was like, "Okay, I need to stop at this point and hand you over to someone else because we went to the same university and similarity attraction bias is going to kick in." And I remember thinking, "Oh, okay, yeah, fair. This is great." But this is hard to spot. It's hard to identify. And to your point as well, Jeremy, how many roles actually need a university degree? Not that many, right? Like truly not that many. I mean, that's one huge area that we limit the talent pool.
Couldn't agree more. I've got an apprentice who we're currently working with who's doing fantastically well. One of my most high-earning individuals from the business that he brings into the organisation. He happens to be a white male, but he doesn't have a university degree, and it's all about attitude and aptitude, and nothing to do with the fact that actually he doesn't have a degree. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, spot on. And there is something about, I mean, as cringe as it is, that making CVs blind, like so you don't see whose CV it is, hiding the names, hiding the photos, and trying as best as we can. It's not bulletproof because at the end of the day, I mean, we know that AI has its own biases. We know that eventually when it comes to an interview, there will be biases at play. But if we can do the DE&I training properly, then we have to try and de-bias the process as much as we can, including promotions.
Yeah, fully agree.
Katrina, you brought up a very interesting area that I interpreted as you've got to trigger change where resistance exists. And I think today, and we perhaps could discuss this a little, we have a unique opportunity in the hybrid working environment, which everybody demands. And the fact that, let's call them legacy managers, who are often of any orientation, but they are often everything from baby boomers like myself through to millennials. But the new talent is principally Gen Z. And they will start in an interview, and I've had this a couple of times, saying, well, my work-life balance obligations are the following, and this is what I want. Whereas most of the managers are brought up to say yes when their boss says jump, and they say how high. How can this be a benefit? How can we address let's call it the ageism bias that often infects the white male population that we're discussing here?
Yeah, great question. And then I think, Jeremy, you wanted to say something that I'll...
Well, you go ahead, Katrina. I'll follow you. That's fine.
Yeah. To me, it's the process of evolution, right? It's literally very basic evolution. And ultimately, I mean, my partner's a teacher, and he has so much faith in younger populations, younger generations, because they have so much more access to information and understanding of mental health and understanding of well-being and understanding of sustainability. These are all really good things that we need more of. And so being able to listen and be flexible and not be stuck in the old status quo is imperative if we want to actually be future-proof and think about how can a company be resilient to, I think the term's like a banny world that we're in now, right? That everything's so volatile and uncertain and constantly changing. We need to listen to younger folks who are at the forefront of a lot of that And actually, ultimately, they're going to be running most of these organizations soon. So being resistant and blocking their voices doesn't make any sense to me. Even if it's scary, even if it doesn't make any financial sense at this point in time, it has to be figured out.
And maybe just to build on that, I think in a hybrid working environment, if you think about where your employees are based, clearly it's nice to be sat next to somebody so you can be trained up. But if you think about the talent pool that you can unlock through having more flexibility. I mean, I've got colleagues who are living in Newcastle or in Cornwall or indeed overseas, who are connected in a different way to their working colleagues through Teams and through other sort of online channels. So the way I see it, I think we have a much broader universe of people that we can work with. So it's a way of attracting a broader range of talent into the organisation, and technology and hybrid working allows that to happen. I think that's good for diversity.
100%. Yeah.
It's so important for mental health, being able to have that flexibility. And I can say that from experience, because I'm sitting in a holiday apartment in the Canary Islands right now, because I'm taking a bit of a break, because it's just that technology is there, so we have to embrace it and use it. And I think any organization that fights against that is going to suffer.
What do you find, Ian?
Yeah, I find I'm just agreeing with what everybody said, if I'm honest. It's. I guess to a certain extent, it comes back to we're preaching to the converted. The people are on. We're all here talking today because we're all the same mindset. And whether it's millennials, whether it's hybrid working, or whatever it is, I think we're all in agreement. But we keep coming back to how do we get the message out to the people that perhaps haven't dialed in today, that aren't engaged, and that we improve life for both, not just the millennials coming through and recognizing their what they want, but the over 50s. Because the other issue that a lot of men are contemplating is no longer is it the norm to retire at 55. Look, when I joined banks, most people left at 55. That was the done thing. That's not the case anymore. And again, for the millennial generation, you're looking at probably 60s, maybe 70. So, how do we take this conversation more broadly? Because we're sort of in agreement.
Very true. And I think a number of you have brought up mental health, and often legacy management, no matter what sector they come from, they make the importance of work paramount in life. And I've always started on the basis that it's just a job. It's important, you meet your commitments, but for example, family comes first. And if your colleagues will not take up the slack if you have an emergency, well, then they're definitely not your colleagues. And setting this up in global organizations that I can't be present in because you can't be everywhere, or you're not, obviously, makes a huge difference, because you get loyalty. They have protected me more than I have benefited them, in my opinion. And your comment of ageism and retirement, I have fun doing what I'm doing, so I would hate to retire. I hate golf, so that's the only option if I retire. So I think let's say we are identifying here and sort of rounding up some of the conversations that some of the victim mentality that people use to excuse avoidance of engagement really should be changed into an opportunity mentality, perhaps, that look positive.
Yeah. So,
I was going to say is, personally, I still struggle slightly with the engagement point. I try so hard. We put on so many different events. Recently, we held a Diwali event, which was organised by various colleagues here. Very few people, if any, from my team turned up. So getting people to actually have the interest, the curiosity, to wish to engage in this topic is disheartening, to put it mildly. Equally, I'm also encouraged when we hosted a workshop on sort of people's experiences at work, and some of the attendees of that workshop included members of my own team who've now are now hosting their own workshops, so that's great. So for once, it's not me pushing them. They're recognizing this as a value, and they are wanting to recreate the same discussion locally within their own teams. So yeah, I have different, both pushing and pulling. Some things seem to work, some things don't. You just got to keep on going with it. I think I'd love to hear more ideas from anybody listening, or indeed this panel, on how we engage people more, because I'd love to get there.
It's really interesting, Jeremy, because I think as leaders we try and put on these events and organise things, and I think, and I shared your frustration as well with some of these areas, but there's a point that we haven't really discussed, which is about leadership shadow, and actually. How impact was that leadership shadow, so that it's great that as leaders we're doing this today, but actually in the day-to-day stuff that we do and the actions that we take, how does that leave a shadow when we're not in the room, and how does it ripple out across the organization so that people are following the lead? So for example, when I'm doing interviews, I have somebody from the Equality Network on the interview panel with me. That might encourage my other junior leaders to do the same when they're interviewing. It might, Jeremy's point, Jeremy was at a Diwali event. Well, Jeremy's there, maybe I'll come along a bit. Now, it's about, some of it for me isn't just about those actions that you do on the day. It's about what you do every day, day in, day out, that it's just the norm. And then people think, okay, that's the normal behavior. I can see what my leader's trying to do. That's what we should behave and act like as well.
Yeah, put it on the agenda. So if you have a team meeting, have a theme or a topic that you share. Yeah, having the right panel for interviewing, doing exit interviews, capturing sort of feedback there, decoding job adverts so that you use language which is more inclusive to encourage more people to apply, really encouraging, taking longer over recruitment processes to make sure that you attract the broadest and most diverse group of candidates. I mean, yeah, putting it into practice, I guess, and making sure that happens in a uniform way globally, but that's easier said than done.
I think, Ian, your comment about leadership and leadership behavior and mirroring and shadowing is extremely important, because people remember what you do in a crisis, not what you do in normality, but when everything is running fine. And they follow you and trust you because of how you protect them and how you behave in a crisis. It's like the old story of, if you are dishonest, you have to remember every lie you ever told to everyone. Whether if you're true to yourself, you just be true to yourself. You have to remember nothing, which as you get older is a bit more difficult, I find. But that's very interesting. Graham, from a holiday perspective, since you've isolated yourself from the world for a couple of weeks, tell me.
We're just jealous.
Yes, that's true. Tell me what you see in perhaps you've discovered in looking back at where you're there and the world still carrying on without you, so to speak. What reflections hit you hardest?
I have a real problem with switching off. I think a lot of the time when you work really hard to get yourself into a senior position, you think you're indispensable, and we all know deep down we're not indispensable. Nobody is, but there is that kind of feeling sometimes. Knocked off a little bit early yesterday because it was beautiful here. Went out and sat by the pool for a bit, and then my wife started shouting at me because I was sitting on my work phone answering emails. She's like, "Put your phone down. You've switched off for the day. Put your phone down." I think it's really important to be able to take time, and this for me is the answer. It takes me a few days to kind of wind down, but it's we like to go away for, if we're lucky enough to be able to afford it, we'd like to go away for long weekends abroad and things like that, city breaks and the like. Doing it this way, 4:30 Friday afternoon, close the laptop, you're actually away. You don't have to go through all the palaver of doing the airport and stuff. So it works for me, and it's my way of kind of winding down and resetting, I guess. It's not for everybody, and I think it does depend what job you do as well. And I have to very carefully kind of coordinate my diary to give me a couple of weeks window when I don't need to be in the office. There are certain things that I do that I have to be in the office for. We have member committee meetings and things like that. We've been doing them hybrid, done them online obviously since the pandemic, but they don't work as well as getting people in a room face to face, particularly if there's a contentious issue to debate or to discuss. I think some things you just need to be in an office for, and that doesn't help the whole inclusion thing when we take into account things like disability and neurodiversity and all that kind of stuff. But for me, it's still important sometimes to get in the room. And I saw with one or two committees and working groups in industry during the pandemic where there was some real tensions built up simply because there were a couple of contentious issues that were under discussion, that because you weren't in the room around the table, they actually got blown out of all proportion, and you were kind of in danger of having some real fallouts and serious fallouts about it. And it's only when you got back in the room together you were able to kind of get that body language better, or it's not necessarily the body language in the room, but it's the chat over the coffee when you take a comfort break, and it's that kind of chat away from the room, the side chats that you don't have when you're around the table. That's what's important, and I think that's what we miss when we have the online stuff.
That's a very interesting perspective, because that ties together a lot of what we've been talking about, that we're looking at inclusion, including how to best communicate, I suppose. And the stress of the pandemic caused people to be stressed by not being together, but that's probably because they couldn't communicate. As we wrap up today, I just want to give everyone 30 seconds to go around with what they've would see as the key learning for what we have here, starting with Katrina.
Me first.
Yeah.
Key learning. Well, actually, I kind of building on Graham's point, what came to my mind there was, and something that I was very cognizant of myself last year when Ukraine war started, my dad's in Ukraine, when that all kicked off, was I suddenly had this kind of real sense of, for those of us who have different areas of discrimination that we are suffering, it's not something that can be switched off. It's never ending. And so the importance of DE&I is that we act faster to prevent unnecessary suffering for people who honestly can't escape it. If you're disabled, you can't escape it in the workplace. It's not something you can just switch off, right? Like, we can't take breaks from this stuff. It has to be worked on. And it's already too late. The time really is now.
Act faster,
Yeah.
Time is now. And Ian, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think one of the things you said earlier on is about being able to bring yourself to work. I remember a great example where we had a graduate intake, and I was talking to one of the grads, and he'd been in the business about 3 years, and he was gay. And he said, Ian, I remember when I joined the bank on the graduate scheme, I'd been at university, I'd come out to my parents, my friends, I was openly gay, all the rest of it. And on the first day, I was being taken around by one of the supervisors, lovely, lovely lady. And she just asked me the question, oh, have you got a girlfriend? And he said, at that moment, I froze. And I didn't answer the question. I fudged it because I wasn't sure. And he said that meant I went back into the closet for 3 years before I felt uncomfortable. And that says something about the culture. It's not a criticism of that lady at all, because she was trying to make that young man feel comfortable on his first day in work and just sort of generally asking questions. The problem was, prior to him joining, he didn't realize that the culture of the organization was everybody can bring themselves to work, and that we support that diversity that Katrina was talking about. And so increasingly we have to think about, how do we just make this part of our DNA? And that's the, I guess, both corporately and personally, so everybody can bring themselves to work.
Jeremy.
I think for me, one of the biggest learnings is to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. So really think from their perspective and understand that different perspective, and then take responsibility for making a difference yourself. So, I mean, for me, one of the moments which I really remember as an enlightening moment was I attended what we called a daring conversation, and this is where you pick a particular theme and you have a discussion around it. This particular theme was to do with Black Lives Matter, and I was listening to this one person and their experience of working in the office, and it dawned on me that they were really not having a great time at all, and were experiencing all sorts of prejudice and difficulties. and I was so shocked because I hadn't seen it. I was totally unaware of it. And for me, at least, that instilled a sense of having to do something about it, and that's probably one of the reasons why I'm here. But that sort of curiosity and encouraging everybody to be curious, to ask, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to learn, to educate yourself, be a better colleague. I think that's real learning for me, and to encourage everybody, irrespective of where they are in the organisation, to take some personal responsibility to do that and to make a difference.
Yeah. And final words from Graham.
Probably summarising what the other three have just said. Really, I think when you see inappropriate behaviour, hear inappropriate or unacceptable language, call it out, speak up. I guarantee you're going to find dozens of allies who'll be supportive of you. Often from colleagues that you didn't think would actually be supportive of the stance. I've found that a lot. So I guess the advice is speak up, speak out, call it out, get out of your comfort zone. You won't regret it. You don't actually know what's going on in somebody else's life. Like, as Jeremy just said, put yourself in their shoes, because you don't know what's going on in their heads. And simple little throwaway comments can be so harmful to people if something's going on in their private life.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with that and all of those comments. And I think the job of a leader, particularly a DEI leader, is indeed to create equality and equity appropriate to the person's capabilities. I earned the unfortunate moniker of being called the equalizer by being able to get rid of a lot of toxic managers. But I think that's what companies need to do. The performance for allowing everybody to bring their whole selves to work can only happen when the barriers are eliminated and when the white male majority that we've been talking about are effectively included on a day-to-day basis. So thank you all very much. Thank you everybody who's listening. Welcome comments on this. And we're now taking a networking break. And when we come back, we'll be in conversation with Azim Rafiq. So thank you everybody, and goodbye.